Hello, beautiful people. Welcome back to Love in Chapters. Before we begin today's story, as always, let us know in the comments section what time and part of the world you're tuning in from. I love seeing our stories reach various hearts across the globe. Today's story is a heartwarming story, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. So, sit back, relax, and if you're not subscribed yet, do so now, so you don't miss our upcoming amazing stories. Now, let's get into it. The early morning light filtered through the thin curtains of the modest two-bedroom apartment, casting soft shadows across the small kitchen where Shirley West stood, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she prepared breakfast. At almost 30 years old, she possessed a quiet beauty that she rarely acknowledged. Warm brown skin that seemed to glow even in exhaustion, expressive eyes that held depths of untold stories, and a gentle smile that she reserved almost exclusively for one person in the world. The apartment was still mostly filled with unpacked boxes, a reminder that they'd only moved in 2 weeks ago. Shirley had been meticulous about the move, carefully selecting this neighborhood after weeks of research. It was quiet, safe, with good schools and neighbors who minded their own business. The rent was slightly more than she could comfortably afford, but she'd make it work. She always did. "Tyrone, baby, breakfast is ready," she called out, her voice carrying the subtle lilt of someone who had lived in 2 countries, neither accent quite erasing the other. The sound of shuffling feet preceded the appearance of a lanky 12-year-old boy, his glasses slightly askew on his face, his hair still rumpled from sleep. Tyrone West was all awkward angles and shy smiles, the kind of kid who preferred books to sports, though lately he'd been showing interest in soccer. He wore pajamas that were getting too short for him, another expense Shirley mentally added to her growing list, and his eyes were still heavy with sleep. He slid into his chair at their small kitchen table, and Shirley set down a plate of scrambled eggs and toast before him. She'd made the eggs exactly the way he liked them, slightly runny, with a pinch of cheese melted through. The toast was buttered on both sides, another small indulgence she allowed herself to give him. "Thanks, Mom," he murmured, his voice still carrying the softness of childhood, though she could hear it beginning to deepen at the edges. He was growing up so fast, too fast. Shirley studied her son as he ate, her heart swelling with the familiar mixture of love and fierce protectiveness that had defined her life since she was barely more than a child herself. 13 years. 13 years since her life had changed irrevocably, since she'd become a mother at 17, since she'd made choices that would ripple through her entire existence, like stones thrown into still water. This apartment, their new apartment, was smaller than what most people would consider comfortable, but to Shirley, it represented something precious: peace. The living room was barely large enough for their second-hand sofa and the small television she'd bought from a thrift store. The bedrooms were cramped, with barely enough space for a bed and a small dresser in each. The kitchen where they sat was so tiny that only 2 people could stand in it comfortably. But it was theirs, and more importantly, it was safe. They'd moved just 2 weeks ago, leaving behind the noisy, rowdy neighborhood where sirens wailed at all hours and neighbors' arguments bled through paper-thin walls. In that place, Shirley had barely slept, always on edge, always listening for danger. She'd watched Tyrone walk to school from their window, her heart in her throat until he disappeared from view, and she wouldn't relax until he came home safely each afternoon. This place, though modest, sat in a quieter area where Tyrone could walk to school without Shirley's heart lodging in her throat with worry. There were trees lining the streets, families with children, a small park just 2 blocks away where she sometimes saw other kids playing after school. It was the kind of neighborhood she'd dreamed of, providing for her son. "You have that math test today, right?" she asked, sitting down across from him with her own modest breakfast, just coffee and a piece of toast. She'd eat more at work, she told herself, though the truth was she often skipped meals to make sure Tyrone had enough. Every penny counted, and Tyrone's growing body needed nutrition more than hers did. Tyrone nodded, pushing his glasses up his nose in a gesture so familiar it made Shirley's heart ache. He'd gotten those glasses 2 years ago, and they were starting to look a bit worn, the frames slightly bent from the time he'd accidentally sat on them. "Yeah, but I studied. I think I'll do okay." "You'll do more than okay," Shirley said firmly, reaching across the small table to squeeze his hand. "You're brilliant, baby. Don't ever forget that." A small smile tugged at Tyrone's lips, and Shirley felt that familiar ache in her chest. He was such a good kid, smart, kind, thoughtful. He never complained about their circumstances, never asked for things they couldn't afford, never made her feel guilty about the life she could provide. He deserved so much more than this small apartment, than a mother who worked as a waitress and counted every penny. He deserved the world, and she was determined to give it to him, even if it took every ounce of strength she possessed. "Mom," Tyrone's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Yes, baby? Are you okay? You look tired." Shirley forced a brighter smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just thinking about my shift today. Nothing for you to worry about." But Tyrone was perceptive, always had been. He studied her with those intelligent eyes that saw too much for a 12-year-old. "You're always tired. Maybe you should ask for fewer hours at work." "I'm fine," she repeated, more firmly this time. "Now finish your breakfast. You don't want to be late for school." After Tyrone left for school, Shirley stood at the window, watching until his small figure disappeared around the corner. He walked with his head down, backpack slung over one shoulder, earbuds in, listening to music, probably, or one of those audiobooks he loved. She watched other kids pass by, some walking in groups, laughing and joking. Tyrone always walked alone, and it broke her heart a little. Only when he was completely out of sight did she allow herself to breathe, to let the mask of confidence slip just a little. Her reflection stared back at her from the window glass, a young woman who looked older than her years, worry lines etched around her eyes despite her youth. When had those appeared? She was only 30, but sometimes she felt ancient. She didn't have friends, not real ones. Anyway, the other waitresses at the restaurant where she worked were nice enough. Maria, who always had funny stories about her 5 kids. Janet, who was studying nursing at night school. Rebecca, who'd been there the longest and knew all the regular customers by name. They were kind to Shirley, invited her to happy hours and girls' nights that she always declined with polite excuses. She kept her distance, offering smiles and pleasantries, but never anything deeper. She never shared details about her life, never talked about where she came from or why she'd moved to America. When they asked personal questions, she deflected with practiced ease, turning the conversation back to them. She didn't do social media. While her coworkers were constantly checking their phones, posting pictures of their lunches and their families, sharing memes and status updates, Shirley's phone remained stubbornly offline except for calls and texts. She had no Facebook, no Instagram, no Twitter, no digital footprints that could be traced. For 2 years, she and Tyrone had lived like ghosts in America, invisible and intentionally unremarkable. It was safer that way. It had to be. As Shirley prepared for her own day, her mind drifted, as it often did in quiet moments, to the past. The memories came unbidden, like fragments of a dream she couldn't quite shake, pieces of a life that felt both intimately familiar and impossibly distant. She was 17 again, sitting in her father's modest home in the UK, in the small living room, with its worn furniture and family photos on the mantel. Her hands trembled as she held the positive pregnancy test, the 2 pink lines that had changed everything. Morgan West, Her father, her rock, her only parent since her mother Vivian had died when Shirley was just 5, sat across from her in his favorite armchair. His weathered face, tanned and lined from years of construction work, was a canvas of conflicting emotions. Disappointment, yes, but also concern, and a love so deep it made Shirley's chest hurt. "Dad, I'm so sorry," she'd whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry." Morgan had been silent for a long moment, his construction worker hands, permanently stained with evidence of his labor, clasped together. She could see him processing, thinking, trying to find the right words. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with disappointment, but not without love. "I won't lie to you, Shirley. This isn't what I wanted for you. You're so smart, so bright. You had your whole future ahead of you. College, a career, everything." "I still do," she'd said, though her voice lacked conviction. How could she? She was 17 and pregnant, still in school, with no idea how she was going to manage. Sean James. Morgan had said the name like it tasted bitter, like poison on his tongue. "That boy is trouble, Shirley. I've told you this before, and I'll tell you again. His brother is mixed up in things no decent person should be near. Drugs, crime, violence. Sean isn't like that, Dad. He's different. He's good to me. He wants to be there for the baby." But was he? Even then, Shirley had harbored doubts, had seen the shadows that sometimes crossed Sean's face, the secrets he kept, the vague answers he gave when she asked about his day. Morgan had sighed, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. Then he'd stood, crossed the small room, and pulled Shirley into his arms. "What's done is done, girl. If you want to keep this baby, I'll support you. I'll help you. But don't expect me to pretend I approve of Sean James, because I don't. I never will." Shirley had clung to her father, breathing in the familiar scent of sawdust and Old Spice, and allowed herself to cry. Shirley shook her head, dispelling the memory as she pulled on her waitress uniform, a simple black dress and white apron that the restaurant provided. She kept it meticulously clean, ironing it every evening so she'd look professional. Appearance mattered, especially when you were trying to be invisible. Blend in, look neat and respectable, don't stand out. That conversation with her father felt like a lifetime ago, though it had been only 13 years. So much had happened since then. So much loss, so much pain, so much fear and heartbreak that sometimes Shirley wondered how she was still standing. Her father had been true to his word. Despite his reservations about Sean, Morgan had supported Shirley through her pregnancy, had been there in the delivery room when Tyrone was born. A tiny, perfect baby who'd come into the world screaming with indignation. Morgan had cried when he held his grandson for the first time, had whispered promises to protect him, to give him a good life, and he'd kept those promises. Morgan had helped raise Tyrone while Shirley finished school. He'd wake up early to feed the baby while Shirley studied for exams. He'd changed diapers, walked the floors when Tyrone was colicky, sung him lullabies in his rough but gentle voice. He'd made it possible for Shirley to go to college on a partial scholarship, working construction during the day and watching Tyrone in the evenings while Shirley attended classes and worked her part-time jobs. He'd worked himself to the bone as a construction worker, taking on extra shifts, overtime, weekend work, anything to make sure Shirley and Tyrone had everything they needed. He'd never complained, never made Shirley feel like a burden, never threw her mistakes in her face. And then he'd gotten sick. The hospital room had been sterile and cold, all white walls and beeping machines and the antiseptic smell that Shirley had come to hate. Morgan lay in the bed, his robust frame diminished by illness, his skin taking on a grayish pallor that terrified her. Various tubes and wires connected him to machines, monitoring his failing body. Shirley had sat beside him, holding his hand. That strong, capable hand that had built houses and held her when she cried and taught her how to ride a bike when she was little. 5-year-old Tyrone played quietly in the corner with toy cars, his presence a small, bright spot in the darkness of that room. "The medical bills, Dad," she'd started, but Morgan had cut her off with a weak squeeze of her hand. "Don't you worry about that, girl. You just focus on your studies, on Tyrone, on building a future." But Shirley had worried. How could she not? The bills were mounting, stacking up like an avalanche waiting to bury them. Her father's insurance covered some of it, but not nearly enough. She'd taken on multiple part-time jobs, waitressing at a cafe in the mornings, working at a bookstore in the afternoons, cleaning offices at night. She'd worked herself ragged, trying to cover the mounting costs of Morgan's care, trying to keep their heads above water. And then Sean had stepped in. Sean, who by then had dropped out of college after his brother was arrested for bank robbery and murder. Sean, who had started hanging around with the wrong crowd, who came around smelling of cigarette smoke and wearing clothes too expensive for someone without a legitimate job. Sean, who'd been drifting away from Shirley and Tyrone until Morgan got sick. "Let me help," he'd said one day, appearing at the hospital with a check that made Shirley's eyes water. "Please, Shirley, let me do this. For Tyrone, for you, for Morgan, even though he never liked me." Desperate, exhausted, and grateful, Shirley had let him. Shirley checked her appearance in the small mirror by the door. Hair pulled back neatly, uniform pressed and clean. Minimal makeup, just enough to look professional. She looked tired, but she always looked tired these days. For 3 years, Sean had paid Morgan's medical bills. 3 long, agonizing years of watching her father fight and fail and fight again. Sean had covered Tyrone's school expenses, had brought groceries, had seemed to be stepping up as a father in a way he never had before. Shirley had allowed herself to hope. She'd started dating Sean again, cautiously at first, then with growing warmth. He'd seemed different, more mature, more responsible. He'd talked about the future, about marriage, about being a family. She'd even moved in with him after Morgan died. The funeral had been small but respectful. Morgan was buried in a modest cemetery on a gray, drizzly day that seemed to match the heaviness in Shirley's heart. Tyrone had stood beside her in his too small suit, crying quietly, not fully understanding that Grandpa wasn't coming back. Sean had been there, supportive and solid, his arm around Shirley's shoulders as they stood by the grave. "I'm here," he'd whispered. "I'm not going anywhere. We're going to be a family, Shirley. I promise." 2 weeks later, Shirley and Tyrone had moved into Sean's bigger apartment in a nicer part of town. It had 2 bedrooms, a real kitchen, a living room with a television that actually worked. To Shirley, exhausted from grief and years of struggling, it had felt like a sanctuary. She hadn't known, or hadn't wanted to know, where the money came from. She'd believed his story about working as a manager at a fancy hotel downtown. She'd ignored the late nights, the secretive phone calls, the strange visitors who'd come by at odd hours. She'd ignored the expensive watches, the designer clothes, the way he always had cash but never seemed to use a bank account. She'd ignored it all because she'd needed to believe in something, someone. She'd needed to believe that things could be okay. For a year and a half, they'd lived together. Sean had been good to Tyrone, taking him to the park, helping with homework, showing up to school events. He'd been good to Shirley too, romantic even, bringing her flowers, taking her to nice restaurants, talking about their future. He'd promised to marry her. They'd even started planning a small wedding, and then Sean had been shot dead in a gang fight, and Shirley's carefully constructed world had shattered like glass. Shirley's hands shook as she tied her apron, the memory still raw even years later. She could still remember the police officer at her door, his face grave and professional. "Miss West, I'm afraid I have some bad news about Sean James." The shock of his death had been devastating enough. But what had truly broken her was what came after. "I'm sorry to inform you that Mr. James was involved in criminal activities," the detective had said, sitting in her living room, Sean's living room, surrounded by things that had been bought with blood money. He was a known associate of Elliot Grant, a crime boss who operates under the guise of legitimate business. Sean was involved in drug trafficking, money laundering, and gang-related violence. The shooting that killed him was retaliation from a rival gang. Shirley had sat there, numb with shock, while 8-year-old Tyrone had been at school, blissfully unaware that his father was dead and that everything they'd believed about him had been a lie. The betrayal had cut deeper than the grief. All those medical bills Sean had paid, drug money, the apartment they lived in, bought with crime, the life she'd been living, built on a foundation of lies and blood. She'd tried to move on after that, to rebuild once again. She'd moved out of Sean's apartment, found a small place she could barely afford, went back to working multiple jobs. She'd been a chef at a fancy restaurant by then, and the pay was better than waitressing, but it still wasn't enough. And then Tyrone, just 8 years old, had gotten sick. The doctor's words had been clinical, detached, the way doctors spoke when they delivered bad news too many times. "He needs surgery immediately. His condition is deteriorating rapidly. Without it, we can't guarantee his survival." Shirley had felt the room spin. "How much?" she'd asked, though she'd already known the answer would be devastating. £60,000. £60,000. She might as well have said 60 million. Shirley had worked every angle, had begged, borrowed, and pleaded. She'd applied for loans and been denied. She'd started a crowdfunding campaign that had raised barely a tenth of what she needed. She'd sold everything of value she owned, which wasn't much. There was no way to raise that kind of money in time. And Tyrone was running out of time, which is how she'd found herself sitting in Elliot Grant's luxurious office, her pride swallowed, her desperation laid bare. Shirley checked her watch. She needed to leave for work in 10 minutes. The restaurant was a 20-minute bus ride away, and she couldn't afford to be late. But the memories kept coming, relentless as a tide, pulling her under. Mr. Grant's office had been all expensive mahogany and leather, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. He'd sat behind his massive desk like a king on a throne, his suit probably costing more than Shirley made in 6 months. He'd been all charm and sympathy at first, his practiced smile never quite reaching his cold eyes. "Of course I'll help you, Miss West. Sean worked for me, and I take care of my people's families. I would give you the loan, and you have as long as 2 years to pay back, my dear." He'd slid the contract across his mahogany desk, pages of legal jargon that Shirley's desperate, terrified brain couldn't process. She'd been focused on one thing: saving her son's life. And so she'd signed without reading it properly. The clause written in faint ink, 400% interest if she couldn't repay within 2 years, had been invisible to her desperate eyes. Or maybe it hadn't been there at all. Maybe Grant had added it later. She'd never know for certain. All she knew was that she'd signed her name, and he'd given her £60,000 in cash, and she'd taken it and run to the hospital where her baby boy was waiting, scared and sick and depending on her to save him. The surgery had been successful. Tyrone had recovered, had come home healthy and whole, and Shirley had thrown herself into work with renewed determination. For 2 years, she'd worked like a woman possessed. As head chef at the fancy restaurant, she'd picked up every extra shift she could. She'd taken on catering jobs on her days off. She'd worked until her feet ached and her hands were covered in burns and cuts from the kitchen. She'd calculated exactly how much she needed to set aside each month. She'd sacrificed everything: new clothes, entertainment, anything beyond absolute necessities. She'd bought groceries based on what was on sale, had turned the heat down in winter to save on bills, had walked instead of taking the bus whenever possible. Every penny she could spare went into the hiding place in her bedroom, tucked behind a loose board in the closet, cash, like Grant had required. Slowly, painfully, the stack had grown, and she'd done it. After 2 years of back-breaking work and sacrifice, she'd saved the £60,000. She'd messaged Mr. Grant, her hands shaking with relief and pride. "I have the money. I can pay you back. Can I come over to your office?" He'd responded that he was out of town on business, but would be back in a few weeks. "Hold on to it. We'll settle this when I return." So she'd held on to it, counting down the days until she'd be free of him, free of the debt, free of the fear. And then someone had broken into her home and stolen it all. Shirley grabbed her purse, forcing her hands to steady, even as the memory made her stomach churn with familiar nausea. Coming home to find her apartment ransacked, her belongings scattered, the hiding place violated, the money, 2 years of backbreaking work and sacrifice, gone. She'd called the police, filed a report, but the officer who'd taken her statement had been pessimistic. "Cash is hard to trace, ma'am. Whoever took it is probably long gone by now. We'll investigate, but I wouldn't get your hopes up." He'd been right. The money was gone, vanished like smoke, and Mr. Grant had been waiting. His penthouse office, a different one from where she'd first met him, even more luxurious, had felt like a trap when she'd arrived for their meeting. Everything about it screamed money and power. The imported marble floors, the priceless art on the walls, the view of the city spread out below like a kingdom. Grant had been sitting at his desk, and his smile when he looked up had been predatory. He'd known. Somehow, he'd known about the theft. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Grant," Shirley had said, fighting back tears. "Someone broke into my apartment and stole the money. I've reported it to the police, but they don't think they'll recover it. I need more time. Please, I'll get the money. I just need more time." "I see," he'd said, standing and walking around his desk with the casual grace of a predator approaching cornered prey. "That is unfortunate, but business is business, Miss West. I know, and I will pay you back. I just need—" "I'll tell you what," he'd interrupted, pulling out the contract she'd signed 2 years ago. "I'll give you another 6 months." Relief had flooded through her. "Thank you, Mr. Grant. Thank you so much. I promise I'll—" "But," he'd continued, his finger pointing to a clause that Shirley didn't remember seeing before. "According to the terms of our agreement, failure to pay within the specified time frame incurs a 400% interest penalty." Shirley had stared at the document, at the clause written in ink that looked faint, faded, but was clearly legible now. Her mind had gone blank with horror. That's £300,000. "Indeed it is. I can't." Her voice had cracked. "I could never come up with that much money. Not in 6 months, not in 6 years. Grant had moved closer, and Shirley had felt every muscle in her body tense with alarm. "There is, however, another way you could settle this debt." His hand had touched her waist, fingers pressing against her hip in a way that made her skin crawl. His breath had been hot on her neck, smelling of expensive cologne and entitlement. "Be my woman, Shirley. Let me take care of you. The debt disappears." Revulsion had churned in Shirley's stomach. She'd pushed him away, not roughly but firmly, her hands shaking. "No, I can't. You're married, and I won't do that." Grant's face had hardened, the mask of charm dropping away to reveal the cold calculation beneath. "Then you have 6 months to come up with £300,000. He'd leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. "Or you'll never see your son again. Do you understand me, Shirley? I am, after all, The reason your son is alive today, I can take that away from you." Shirley locked the door behind her and headed to work, her legs moving automatically while her mind remained trapped in memory. That threat had haunted her for months. She'd felt watched, followed, paranoid. Every stranger on the street was a potential threat. Every car that drove too slowly past her house made her heart race. Every time Tyrone was late coming home from school, she'd imagined the worst. For 6 months, she'd tried desperately to come up with the money. She'd worked herself sick, taken on debt, begged for loans, but there was no way, no legal way, to raise £300,000 in 6 months. And then, one evening, the solution had presented itself. Tyrone had come home from school upset, throwing his backpack down with unusual force. "I hate that school, Mom. I hate it there." Shirley had sat down beside him on their worn couch, her arm around his shoulders. "What happened, baby? The kids make fun of me. They call me names. They think I'm weird because I like reading, and I'm not good at sports. Some of them even talk about Dad, calling him a criminal." His voice had cracked, and Shirley's heart had broken for him. "I want to change schools. I want to get away from this whole city. I hate it here." And in that moment, the thought had crystallized in Shirley's mind. She could run. She could take her son and disappear. Go to America, the country of her birth, the place she'd left when she was only 5 years old. Start over somewhere Mr. Grant's reach couldn't extend, somewhere they could be safe. It was crazy. It was desperate. But what choice did she have? A few weeks later, Shirley had taken her son and vanished to America. She'd sold everything they owned, bought plane tickets with cash, and disappeared in the middle of the night. She'd been terrified the entire flight, convinced that Grant's men would be waiting at every airport, that they'd be caught and punished for running. But they'd made it. They'd arrived in America, and Shirley had been meticulous about covering their tracks. She'd gotten a small job as a waitress at a restaurant, not using her chef skills because that might make her easier to find. She'd enrolled Tyrone in school under her maiden name. She'd rented apartments month to month, always ready to run again if necessary. And it had worked. For 2 years, they'd lived in peace. Not luxury, not comfort, but peace, safety. Life wasn't perfect. Money was always tight. The work was exhausting, and Shirley missed having friends, having a life beyond work and motherhood. But Tyrone was happy, thriving in school, no longer bullied or scared. That was worth everything. Now, standing at the bus stop waiting for her ride to work, Shirley allowed herself a small, tired smile. They'd made it. 2 years and no sign of Mr. Grant or his people. Maybe his threat had been empty. Maybe he'd moved on to other victims. Maybe they were finally, truly safe. She didn't know that across the city, a text message was being prepared. She didn't know that her carefully constructed peaceful life was about to shatter. She just knew that she needed to get to work, put in her shift, and come home to her son, one day at a time. That's how you survived. Meanwhile, across the city, in a world so different it might as well have been another planet, Damian Langston woke up with a pounding headache and the uncomfortable awareness that he wasn't alone in his bed. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Damian's penthouse was harsh and unforgiving, cutting through the darkness like a knife through silk. Damian's head pounded with the familiar rhythm of a hangover, a dull, persistent throb that seemed to echo with every beat of his heart. His mouth felt like cotton, dry and stale, tasting of whiskey and regret. He groaned, reaching blindly for his phone on the nightstand, his fingers fumbling across the smooth surface until they found it. The screen lit up with an aggressive brightness that made him wince, and the number of missed calls made his stomach drop. 7 from his secretary, Margaret, 3 from Laura, 2 from his mother, and a string of increasingly frantic text messages that all screamed the same thing in varying degrees of panic and exasperation. "Damn," he muttered, the word coming out rough and gravelly. He'd completely forgotten about the board meeting. How had he forgotten? This wasn't just any meeting. This was the Gregg investment meeting, the one that could potentially bring in millions for the company's new tech expansion. Mr. Gregg was notoriously particular, the kind of investor who valued punctuality and professionalism above all else. Damien turned his head, and the movement sent a fresh wave of pain through his skull. Faye was still there, sleeping peacefully beside him, her blonde hair spread across his expensive pillows like a golden halo. She looked beautiful in the morning light, serene and content, completely unaware of the chaos about to unfold. For a moment, Damien allowed himself to appreciate the sight, the curve of her shoulder, the gentle rise and fall of her breathing, the way her lips were slightly parted in sleep. She'd been fun last night, vivacious and witty, with a laugh that had drawn him in from across the bar. They'd talked about art and music, had debated the merits of classic cinema versus modern blockbusters, and somewhere between the third and fourth drink, he'd found himself genuinely enjoying her company. But now, in the harsh light of day with his phone buzzing with professional catastrophe, she was a complication he didn't have time for. Damien swung his legs out of bed, his feet hitting the heated marble floor, and stood up carefully, trying not to disturb her. He padded across the expansive bedroom, which was larger than most people's entire apartments, toward his bathroom. The space was all marble and chrome, gleaming with the kind of cleanliness that came from having a cleaning service that cost more per month than most people's rent. He turned on the shower, setting it as hot as he could stand, and stepped under the multiple jets. The water pounded against his skin, washing away the sweat and alcohol smell of the previous night. Steam filled the bathroom, fogging up the mirrors and creating a cocoon of heat and moisture. As the water ran over him, Damien tried to piece together the timeline of his evening. Jake and Terry had dragged him out for what was supposed to be one celebratory drink after closing a major deal. One drink had become 3, and then Faye had appeared at their table with her friends, all smiles and laughter and the kind of confidence that came from knowing you were beautiful. He'd been drawn to her immediately. He always was. The flirtation had been easy, natural, the kind of dance he'd perfected over years of practice. Within an hour, they'd been kissing at the bar, much to Jake's eye-rolling and Terry's amused commentary. Within 2 hours, they'd been in a taxi heading back to his place, her hand on his thigh, his lips on her neck. The rest of the night was a blur of champagne and tangled limbs, and the kind of pleasure that came without complications or expectations, or so he'd thought. 20 minutes later, Damien emerged from the shower, feeling marginally more human. He wrapped a towel around his waist and moved to his walk-in closet, which was organized with military precision by his housekeeper, and selected a charcoal gray Tom Ford suit. The suit cost more than most people earned in a month, but it made him look like the CEO he was supposed to be, professional and commanding. He dressed quickly, his movements practiced and efficient. White shirt, crisp and perfectly pressed. Silk tie in a shade of blue that matched his eyes. Laura had bought it for him last Christmas, claiming it made him look less like a playboy and more like a businessman. Jacket that fit him perfectly, tailored to emphasize his broad shoulders and lean frame. Italian leather shoes that cost a small fortune. As he knotted his tie in the mirror, Damien caught sight of his reflection and paused. He looked tired, he realized. The late nights and early mornings were starting to show around his eyes, fine lines that hadn't been there a year ago. Damien shook his head, dispelling the thought. He didn't have time for existential crises. He had a meeting to get to, a multi-million-dollar deal to salvage, and a woman in his bed that he needed to politely but firmly usher out. He returned to the bedroom to find Faye stirring, her eyes fluttering open as she stretched languidly across his sheets. When she saw him, fully dressed and obviously preparing to leave, a small frown creased her forehead. "Hey," she said, her voice still husky with sleep. "You're up early. Actually, I'm up late," Damien corrected, glancing at his watch. "It's past 1 in the afternoon. I overslept. I've got an important meeting that I'm already catastrophically late for." Faye sat up, the sheet falling away to reveal skin that Damien had explored thoroughly just hours ago. Under different circumstances, he might have been tempted to crawl back into bed with her, to let the world wait while he lost himself in pleasure and forgetfulness. But not today. Today, his professional life was hanging by a thread, and he couldn't afford any more mistakes. "I thought maybe we could grab some breakfast," Faye said, a hopeful note in her voice that made Damien's chest tighten with something that might have been guilt. "Or lunch, I guess, given the time. There's this great brunch place downtown that—" "I really can't," Damien interrupted, and he could hear the practiced smoothness in his own voice, the well-worn excuse that he'd used 100 times before. "I'm already in serious trouble with my board. This meeting is crucial, and I've already blown it by not showing up on time." Faye's expression shifted, disappointment clouding her features, but she nodded with what looked like understanding. "Right. Of course. Important CEO business." She started to get out of bed, moving to gather her clothes from where they'd been hastily discarded the night before. Her dress draped over his chair, her heels kicked off by the door, her purse abandoned on his dresser. As she dressed, there was an awkwardness in the air that hadn't been there last night, when everything had been easy and fun and uncomplicated. Damien watched her for a moment, then made a decision that he would regret within the next 5 minutes. He pulled out his wallet, Italian leather, monogrammed, filled with credit cards that had no spending limit, and extracted several $100 bills. It was far more than cab fare required, probably 5 or 6 times what a ride across the city would cost. "Here," he said, holding out the money. "For your troubles." The words had barely left his mouth when he saw Faye's entire demeanor change. The warmth that had been in her eyes just moments ago, sleepy and content and maybe even a little affectionate, froze over completely, replaced by something that looked like hurt and humiliation and rapidly building anger. She stared at the money in his outstretched hand as if it were something offensive, something dirty. Her jaw tightened, her hands clenching at her sides, and when she finally looked up at him, her eyes were blazing. "You're paying me?" Her voice was dangerously quiet, each word carefully enunciated, the kind of quiet that preceded a storm. "You're actually standing there, paying me like I'm some kind of hooker?" Damien's hand faltered, the bills suddenly feeling heavy and wrong. "What? No, that's not..." He stumbled over his words, trying to backtrack, trying to explain. "It's just for the cab. I gave you extra because I know it's a long ride across town and..." "And what?" Faye's voice rose, sharp and cutting. "You thought throwing money at me would make everything okay? You thought that's what this was?" "I didn't mean it like that," Damien protested, but even as he said the words, he could hear how hollow they sounded. "I was just trying to help." The slap came out of nowhere, fast and hard, cracking across his cheek with enough force to snap his head to the side. The sound echoed in the large bedroom, sharp and final, and Damien's ears rang from the impact. His cheek stung, a burning sensation that spread across his skin, and he could already feel the heat of what would probably be a visible handprint. "Help?" Faye's voice was shaking now, trembling with emotion. Hurt and anger and disappointment all tangled together. "You want to help? Here's some help. Grow the hell up, Damien." She snatched her purse from the dresser, her movements jerky and furious, and for a moment Damien thought she might hit him again. Instead, she grabbed the money from his hand, the money that had caused all this, and threw it back at him. The bills fluttered through the air like confetti, landing on the floor, on the bed, scattered and meaningless. "Keep your money," she spat, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You're going to need it, because money is literally all you're ever going to have. My friends warned me about you, you know. Damian Langston, the Playboy CEO who treats women like disposable toys. He'll charm you, sleep with you, and toss you aside like yesterday's newspaper." Each word landed like a physical blow, and Damian found himself unable to speak, unable to defend himself because some part of him knew she was right. "But I didn't listen," Faye continued, pulling on her heels with sharp, angry movements. "I thought, maybe I'm different. God, I'm so stupid." "Faye, I'm sorry," Damian managed, his voice rough. "I really didn't mean to insult you. I just thought—" "You didn't think," she interrupted, whirling on him one last time. "That's the problem, Damian. You don't think about how your actions affect other people. You don't think about what it feels like to be treated like you're worthless the morning after. You just go through life taking what you want and discarding what you don't need, and you don't even care about the mess you leave behind." She moved toward the door, but paused at the threshold, turning back to deliver one final blow that would echo in Damian's mind for days to come. "You're going to die alone, Damian. Rich and handsome and successful, sure, but completely, utterly alone. Because you don't know the first thing about treating people like they matter. Like they're more than just a warm body for the night. And by the time you figure it out, if you ever figure it out, it'll be too late." The door slammed behind her with enough force to rattle the expensive artwork on his walls. Pieces he'd bought because his interior designer said they were good investments, not because he actually cared about art. The sound reverberated through the penthouse, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy and accusatory. Damian stood frozen for a long moment, his cheek still stinging from the slap, Faye's words ringing in his ears like a curse. He should feel worse about this, he knew. He should feel guilty, ashamed, remorseful. He should feel something beyond the vague discomfort that was currently churning in his stomach. But the truth was, beneath the momentary sting of her words, he felt mostly relief that she was gone. Relief that he didn't have to navigate the awkward morning-after conversation, didn't have to pretend to care about making breakfast plans or exchanging numbers with the promise of future contact that would never actually happen. This was easier, he told himself. Clean. No expectations, no complications. He bent down to gather the scattered bills from the floor, expensive money that suddenly felt cheap and meaningless. As he collected them, his phone buzzed again. Margaret, calling for what must have been the 10th time. With a sigh, he answered. I know, he said before she could launch into a lecture. I'm on my way. How bad is it? Margaret's voice came through sharp and professional, but laced with exasperation. Bad, Damian. Mr. Gregg is threatening to pull the entire investment. He's been sitting in that conference room for 2 hours with the board, and he's about 5 minutes away from walking out completely. Several board members are not happy. Phillips actually used the word unprofessional, and you know how much he usually defends you. I'll be there in 15 minutes, Damian promised, already grabbing his keys from the bowl by the door. Tell them I'm on my way. Tell them there was a family emergency or something. I've already told them 3 different stories, Margaret shot back. At this point, they know you overslept. Just get here. Now. She hung up without waiting for a response, and Damian pocketed his phone with a grimace. He looked around his penthouse one last time, at the scattered money on the floor, at the rumpled bed that still smelled like Faye's perfume, at the empty champagne glasses on the nightstand, and felt a wave of something that might have been disgust wash over him. You're going to die alone. He pushed the thought away, grabbed his keys to the Ferrari. He needed speed today, needed the distraction of the engine's roar and the city blurring past, and headed out. The drive to the office should have taken 20 minutes in normal traffic, but Damien pushed the Ferrari hard, weaving through lanes with the kind of recklessness that came from knowing he could afford any ticket. The city passed by in a blur of buildings and pedestrians and other cars that seemed to be moving in slow motion compared to his urgency. As he drove, his mind kept drifting back to Faye's words, to the look in her eyes when he'd offered her that money. He'd genuinely been trying to help, hadn't he? He'd given her far more than cab fare required. He'd been generous. So why did it feel so wrong? Because you reduced her to a transaction, a small voice in his head whispered. Because you made her feel like what you shared last night was something you could pay for and dismiss. But it had been just a casual hookup, hadn't it? That's what they'd both signed up for when they left the bar together. No strings attached, just fun and pleasure, and the understanding that it wouldn't go anywhere. Except Faye hadn't understood that. Or maybe she had, but she'd hoped for something different, something more. And Damien had crushed that hope with a handful of $100 bills. His phone rang through the car's Bluetooth system, and Jake's name flashed on the dashboard screen. Damien answered, half expecting another lecture. "Please tell me you're not still in bed with that blonde from last night," Jake said by way of greeting. "I'm on my way to the office," Damien replied, taking a turn too fast and hearing the Ferrari's tires squeal in protest. "And she's already gone. It didn't end well. Let me guess. You tried to pay her for the cab." Damien's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "How did you?" "Because you always do that, man. Every single time. You think you're being generous and considerate, but what you're actually doing is making women feel like hookers. One of these days, one of them is going to do more than just slap you." "She did slap me," Damien admitted. Jake's sigh came through the speakers, heavy with a mixture of exasperation and concern. "You've got to stop this, Damien. This whole Playboy routine, the revolving door of women, the commitment phobia, it's getting old. You're 35, not 25. Don't you ever want something more?" "More of what? Heartbreak? Disappointment? The inevitable end of every relationship when people realize they're not who they thought they were." Damien's voice was sharper than he'd intended. "I've seen how this story ends, Jake. I grew up in foster homes, remember? I saw couples who claimed to love each other tear each other apart. I saw what happens when love turns into something ugly." "You also saw Richard and Iris," Jake countered quietly. "You saw what real love looks like. A couple who chose to adopt 2 teenagers when they could have had an easier life. A couple who's still madly in love after 30 years of marriage." The words hit harder than they should have, cutting through Damien's defenses like a knife. He wanted to argue, to defend his choices, to explain that his way was safer, cleaner, less likely to end in the kind of pain he'd witnessed growing up. But another call was coming through. Margaret, again, and he needed to focus on damage control with the board. "I have to go," he told Jake. "Meeting crisis." "Damien," Jake started, but Damien had already switched over to Margaret's call. "I'm 5 minutes away," he said, checking his GPS. "Is Greg still there?" "Barely." "Get here fast." Damien pressed harder on the accelerator, the Ferrari responding with a surge of power that pushed him back into the seat. The city flew past, a blur of concrete and glass, and people living their ordinary lives, completely unaware of the chaos unfolding in his. He was so focused on the road ahead, on getting to the office, on salvaging this deal, that he didn't think to be more careful. He didn't think about the fact that his distraction could have consequences beyond just his professional life. Meanwhile, across the city, Shirley West was having what had started as a perfectly normal morning. The restaurant where she worked as a waitress was called Le Bernardin, an upscale establishment that catered to the kind of clientele who thought nothing of spending $200 on a single meal. This morning had been busy, but manageable. The lunch crowd was starting to filter in. Business people on their lunch breaks, wealthy ladies who lunched, a couple celebrating an anniversary in the corner booth. Shirley moved between tables with practiced efficiency, her smile professional and warm, but never quite reaching her eyes. She was in the middle of taking an order from table 7, a middle-aged couple debating between the salmon and the sea bass, when her phone buzzed in the pocket of her apron. She ignored it, focusing on her customers, making recommendations, ensuring they felt valued and heard. When she finally had a moment to check her phone, stepping into the small break room behind the kitchen, her world tilted on its axis. The text was from an unknown number, just 2 words that sent ice flooding through her veins. "Found you, Miss West. You can't hide from me," the message read. Shirley's hands began to shake, the phone trembling in her grip as she stared at those 2 words. No, this couldn't be happening. Not now. Not after 2 years of careful hiding, of building a life, of finally feeling safe. Her mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was a wrong number. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe it was... Her phone buzzed again, and this time, the message contained a photo. The image that filled her screen made her legs go weak, made her heart stop in her chest, made the world narrow down to a single, terrifying point of focus. It was Tyrone, her son, her boy, standing outside his school with his friends, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his glasses catching the sunlight. The photo had been taken today. She could tell by his clothes, the blue shirt she'd ironed for him that morning, the jeans he'd insisted on wearing, even though they were getting a bit short on him. Someone had been watching him. Someone had been close enough to take this photo. Someone knew where he was, what school he attended. Someone had found them. The phone slipped from Shirley's suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering to the break room floor. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps, her vision tunneling, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, in her ears, in every pulse point of her body. Mr. Grant. It had to be Mr. Grant. After 2 years, after she'd thought they were safe, he'd found them. And he'd sent her a message that was crystal clear. "I know where your son is. I can get to him whenever I want." The threat he'd made 2 years ago echoed in her mind with terrifying clarity. "You'll never see your son again." Shirley bent down to grab her phone with shaking hands, her mind already made up. She had to get to Tyrone. She had to get to him now. Nothing else mattered. Not her job, not the customers waiting for their orders, not the professional reputation she'd carefully built. All that mattered was her son. She burst out of the break room, nearly colliding with Maria, who was carrying a tray of drinks. "Whoa, Shirley, you okay?" Maria asked, her usually cheerful face creasing with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I have to go," Shirley said, her voice coming out strangled and unfamiliar to her own ears. "Emergency, family emergency." She didn't wait for a response, didn't wait for permission from her manager, didn't even grab her purse from her locker. She just ran, through the kitchen where chefs looked up in surprise, through the back door that led to the alley, out onto the street where the city noise hit her like a physical force. Her hands fumbled as she tried to hail a cab, waving frantically at the yellow vehicles that passed by. One finally stopped, and she threw herself into the back seat, breathless and terrified. "Where to?" the driver asked, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a thick accent. "Riverside Middle School," she gasped out. "Please, it's an emergency. I need to get there as fast as possible." The driver must have heard the panic in her voice because he pulled into traffic immediately, navigating through the midday congestion with practiced ease. But it wasn't fast enough. Nothing was fast enough. Every red light felt like an eternity. Every car in front of them felt like an insurmountable obstacle. Shirley kept checking her phone, hoping for another message, dreading another message, her mind spinning through worst-case scenarios. What if Mr. Grant had sent someone to take Tyrone right now? What if her son was already gone? What if she was too late? No, she couldn't think like that. Tyrone was fine. He was at school, surrounded by teachers and other students. He was safe. He had to be safe. But her hands wouldn't stop shaking, and her breath wouldn't come normally, and fear had wrapped itself around her chest like a vice, squeezing tighter with every passing second. They were about 3 blocks from the school when Shirley felt the cab slow down in a way that had nothing to do with traffic. The engine made a sputtering noise, coughing and wheezing like a sick animal. The driver's cheerful demeanor shifted to concern as he glanced at his dashboard. "No, no, no," he muttered, trying to coax the vehicle forward. But the sputtering grew worse, and with a final, decisive cough, the engine died completely. The cab rolled to a stop on the side of the road, dead and useless. "I'm so sorry, miss," the driver said, already reaching for his radio to call for assistance. "Engine trouble. I can call another cab." But Shirley was already out of the vehicle, her door slamming behind her as she started running. 3 blocks. She could run 3 blocks. She'd run marathons, if it meant getting to her son, if it meant keeping him safe. The city seemed to blur around her as she ran, pedestrians stepping out of her way in surprise, car horns blaring as she darted across streets without looking properly, her lungs burning with the effort of pushing her body faster, faster, always faster. Her waitress shoes, practical flats designed for hours of standing, slapped against the pavement with each step. Her uniform felt restrictive, too tight around her chest as she struggled to breathe. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool autumn air, and her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might burst through. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The school came into view. A large brick building with a playground to one side and a parking lot to the other. Students were visible outside, enjoying what must be a break between classes, their laughter and shouts carrying on the air, so innocent, so unaware of the danger. And there he was, Tyrone, her son, standing near the fence with a group of boys she recognized as his friends. He was laughing at something one of them said, his head thrown back, his glasses sliding down his nose in that way they always did, so perfect and whole and safe. Relief flooded through Shirley, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. He was okay. He was safe. She'd made it in time. "Tyrone," she screamed, her voice raw and desperate, carrying across the distance between them. "Tyrone." Her son's head snapped up at the sound of his name, his eyes searching for the source. When he spotted her, his expression shifted from surprise to confusion. His mother was at work. Why was she here? Why was she running toward him like something terrible had happened? Shirley didn't slow down, didn't pause to catch her breath or look where she was going. All she could see was her son. All she could think about was reaching him, holding him, making sure he was real and solid and safe in her arms. She ran toward the school, her eyes locked on Tyrone, her mind filled with nothing but relief and the desperate need to touch him, to confirm with her own hands that he was okay. She didn't see the road she was about to cross. She didn't see the traffic light that was red for pedestrians. She didn't see the sleek Ferrari approaching from the left, moving too fast, the driver distracted by a phone call about board meetings and investment deals. She didn't see any of it until it was too late. Damien was less than a mile from his office when Margaret's call came through the Ferrari's Bluetooth system. He'd switched lanes aggressively, cutting off a Honda that had been going too slow, earning himself an angry horn blast that he barely registered. "I'm almost there," he said by way of greeting, his eyes flicking between the road and his GPS. "2 minutes out. Is Greg still—" "He's threatening to leave," Margaret interrupted, her voice clipped and professional but laced with urgency. "I've stalled him as long as I can, but Damien, you need to get here now. Phillips just pulled me aside and said, if you don't show up in the next few minutes, He's calling for a vote of no confidence. Phillips can kiss my... Damien started, but movement in his peripheral vision cut him off. A woman had appeared at the edge of his vision, running from the sidewalk toward the street. She wasn't looking at traffic, wasn't checking for cars, wasn't paying attention to anything, except whatever destination she was running toward with such desperate urgency. She was going to step right into the road, right into his path. Time seemed to slow down in that terrible way it does when your brain recognizes disaster, but your body can't move fast enough to prevent it. Damien's foot slammed on the brake pedal, his hands jerking the wheel to the right, the Ferrari's tires screaming in protest as they fought for traction on the asphalt. But it was too late. He was going too fast. He was too close. The physics of velocity and mass and momentum were already written, the outcome already determined. The woman, a beautiful woman with brown skin and terror in her eyes, ran directly into his path. The impact was horrifying. The sickening thud of the Ferrari's front bumper connecting with her body, the terrible sound of her hitting the hood, the awful moment when she seemed to hang suspended in the air before gravity reasserted itself, and she fell, hard, onto the unforgiving pavement. The Ferrari screeched to a complete stop, leaving black skid marks on the road like evidence of guilt. Damien's seatbelt had locked, holding him in place, and for a moment he couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what had just happened. From his phone, still connected to Bluetooth, Margaret's voice came through tinny and distant. "Damien, Damien, what was that sound? Are you there?" But Damien wasn't listening anymore. He was fumbling with his seatbelt, his hands shaking so badly he could barely work the mechanism, his breath coming in short, shocked gasps. When he finally got free and stumbled out of the car, the scene that greeted him was like something out of a nightmare. The woman lay motionless on the pavement, her limbs at unnatural angles, blood beginning to pool beneath her head. Her eyes were closed, her face peaceful in a way that was terrifying because it looked like death, like she'd already left her body behind. And running toward her, screaming, crying, his young face twisted in absolute horror, was a boy of about 12 or 13. He wore glasses that were too big for his face, a blue shirt, jeans that were slightly too short. His backpack bounced against his shoulders as he ran, and the sound coming from his throat was something no child should ever have to make. "Mom! Mom! No! No! No!" The boy's voice cracked, breaking on the words, tears already streaming down his face as he dropped to his knees beside the woman. "Mom!" The word hit Damien like a physical blow. This woman he'd just hit with his car, was this boy's mother. The world seemed to crystallize around that single, terrible fact. Time, which had been moving in slow motion, suddenly sped up with terrifying velocity. People were emerging from everywhere. From the school building, from cars that had stopped in the street, from shops and businesses nearby. Someone was shouting to call an ambulance. Someone else was saying not to move her. A woman, a teacher, maybe, was trying to pull the boy away from his mother's body, but he fought her, clinging to his mother's hand, his glasses fogged with tears. Damien moved on autopilot, his training from a first aid course he'd taken years ago kicking in. He dropped to his knees on the other side of the woman, his expensive suit pants grinding into the dirty pavement, and reached for her wrist to check for a pulse. It was there, faint, but steady. She was alive. Thank God, she was alive. "Don't move her," he said to the crowd, his voice coming out steadier than he felt. "Neck injury. We need to keep her still until the ambulance gets here." "You hit her!" The boy's voice was accusing, vicious with grief and terror. "You killed her. You killed my mom." "She's alive," Damien said, looking at the boy, really looking at him for the first time. The kid's face was a mask of anguish, tears, and snot running down his cheeks, his whole body shaking. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. But she's alive. She's breathing. The ambulance is coming." And it was. The sound of sirens was already audible in the distance, growing closer with every second. Damien had never been particularly religious, had never been one to pray. But in that moment, kneeling on the pavement with this woman's blood on his hands and her son's hatred burning into him, he found himself bargaining with whatever higher power might be listening. Please let her be okay. Please don't let her die. I'll do anything. I'll change everything. Just please let her live. Is less than #0. 7 is greater than. The ambulance arrived in what felt like both an eternity and no time at all. Paramedics swarmed the scene with professional efficiency, gently but firmly pushing Damien and the boy back as they assessed the woman's injuries. Possible head trauma, one of them was saying into a radio. Unresponsive but breathing. Pupils reactive. We need to move fast. They strapped her to a backboard with practiced care, securing her neck, checking her vital signs, working with the kind of urgent precision that suggested every second counted. The boy tried to climb into the ambulance with them, but a paramedic stopped him. "Are you family?" she asked, not unkindly. "He's her son," Damien heard himself say. "I'll bring him. I'll follow you to the hospital." The paramedic nodded, already turning back to her patient. "St. Mary's, drive safe." And then they were gone, the ambulance pulling away with lights flashing and siren wailing, carrying Shirley West away to a fate that Damien had put into motion with his distraction, his speed, his careless assumption that the road would be clear. The boy, Tyrone, Damien would learn later, stood on the sidewalk, watching the ambulance disappear, his whole body rigid with shock. His friends hovered nearby, uncertain and scared, and the teacher who'd been trying to comfort him had her hand on his shoulder, but he seemed completely alone in his grief. Damien approached slowly, carefully, like one might approach a wounded animal. "Hey," he said softly, "I'm going to take you to the hospital, to your mom, okay?" Tyrone turned to look at him, and the hatred in his young eyes was pure and absolute. "I don't want to go anywhere with you. You hit her. You hurt her." "I know," Damien said, and his voice cracked on the words. "I know, and I'm so sorry. But she needs you, and I'm going to make sure you get to her. I promise." For a long moment, the boy just stared at him, his jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists. Then, with a jerky nod, he followed Damien to the Ferrari. The drive to St. Mary's Hospital was silent, except for the sound of Tyrone's quiet crying in the passenger seat. Damien wanted to say something, wanted to offer comfort or reassurance or apologies, but what words could possibly be adequate? What could he possibly say that would make any of this better? So he drove in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly, his mind replaying the accident over and over in a loop of guilt and horror. The thud of impact. The terrible moment when she'd flown through the air. The blood spreading across the pavement like an accusation. "This is your fault. This is all your fault." When they arrived at the hospital, Tyrone was out of the car before Damien had even fully stopped, running toward the emergency entrance with the desperate energy of a child who'd already lost too much. Damien parked haphazardly and followed, jogging to catch up. Inside, the hospital was a chaos of fluorescent lights and antiseptic smells, and people in various states of medical crisis. Damien found Tyrone at the reception desk, his voice shrill and breaking as he tried to get information. "My mom. She was just brought in. Shirley West. Where is she? I need to see her." The receptionist, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, was trying to calm him down, but Tyrone was beyond calm, beyond reason. He was a child whose mother had just been hit by a car, and nothing else in the world mattered. Damien stepped up to the desk, pulling out his wallet. "I'm Damien Langston. I'm the one who... I was involved in the accident. This is her son. Please, what can you tell us?" The receptionist's eyes widened slightly at his name. Recognition of the Langston name, the power and money it carried. And her demeanor shifted subtly. "She's being evaluated now. The doctors are with her. If you'll both please take a seat in the waiting area, someone will come update you as soon as we know more." But Tyrone refused to sit. He paced the waiting room like a caged animal, his hands shaking, his breathing uneven, his glasses fogged with tears he kept trying to wipe away. Other people in the waiting room watched him with sympathy, but no one approached. Damien sat in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs, his head in his hands, his expensive suit rumpled and stained with blood. Shirley's blood. His phone kept buzzing with calls from Margaret, from the office, from board members demanding to know where he was. He ignored them all. For the first time in his professional life, the company didn't matter. The deal didn't matter. The board's opinion didn't matter. All that mattered was the woman in the emergency room and the devastated boy pacing in front of him. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, visible through the hospital windows, marking the passage of time with indifferent precision. Doctors and nurses came and went, attending to other patients, other emergencies. The waiting room gradually filled and emptied, and filled again with other worried families. But there was no news about Shirley West. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a doctor emerged. A woman in her 40s with tired eyes and the kind of calm demeanor that came from years of delivering both good news and bad. Family of Shirley West. Tyrone was at her side in an instant, Damien close behind. "That's my mom. Is she okay? Please tell me she's okay." The doctor's expression was carefully neutral, professionally sympathetic. "Your mother sustained significant head trauma in the accident. We've stabilized her, but she's fallen into a coma. We're monitoring her closely, but at this point, we can't predict when or if she'll wake up." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. A coma. Shirley West was in a coma because of him, because Damien had been distracted, because he'd been driving too fast, because he'd been too focused on his meeting to pay attention to the road. Tyrone made a sound, something between a sob and a gasp, and his legs seemed to give out beneath him. Damien caught him automatically, his arms wrapping around the boy's thin shoulders, holding him up as his world crumbled. "Can I see her?" Tyrone asked through his tears. "Please, I need to see her." The doctor hesitated, then nodded. "For a few minutes. But she won't respond. You need to understand that. She can't hear you right now." But Tyrone was already moving, following the doctor down the hallway, and Damien followed because he couldn't not follow, because he needed to see the damage he'd done, needed to face the consequences of his actions. Shirley West lay in a hospital bed that made her look small and fragile, surrounded by machines that beeped and whirred, keeping her alive, monitoring her vitals. Her head was bandaged, her face peaceful in sleep, and if it weren't for all the medical equipment, she might have just been resting. Tyrone approached the bed slowly, as if afraid she might disappear if he moved too quickly. When he reached her side, he took her hand carefully, his fingers wrapping around hers, and the sob that broke from his chest was heartbreaking in its raw pain. "Mom," he whispered. "Mom, please wake up. Please, I need you. Please don't leave me." Damien stood in the doorway, unable to look away, unable to leave, witnessing this private moment of grief that he'd caused. And in that moment, watching this boy beg his mother to wake up, something fundamental shifted inside him. All his life, Damien had lived for himself, his pleasure, his success, his freedom. He'd avoided responsibility, avoided commitment, avoided anything that might require him to put someone else's needs before his own desires. But looking at Tyrone now, This brave, devastated child who just lost the only family he had. Damien felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of responsibility that went beyond professional obligations or social contracts. This was his fault. This boy's pain was his fault. And somehow, some way, he was going to make it right, even if he had no idea how. The days that followed the accident blurred together in a haze of hospital corridors, hushed conversations with doctors, and the constant, oppressive weight of guilt that sat on Damien's chest like a boulder. Shirley remained in her coma, unresponsive to the various tests and stimuli the doctors tried. The medical team spoke in carefully measured tones about brain activity and Glasgow coma scales, and the unpredictable nature of traumatic brain injuries. What they couldn't tell Damien, what no one could tell him, was when, or even if, Shirley would wake up. Every day, Damien visited the hospital, sometimes twice a day. He'd sit in the chair beside Shirley's bed while machines monitored her steady but unconscious breathing, and he'd talk to her. About nothing, about everything, about Tyrone, about the company, about how sorry he was. He knew she couldn't hear him. The doctors had made that clear. But talking to her made him feel slightly less helpless, slightly less like the architect of this tragedy. Tyrone came to visit as often as the hospital would allow, which meant Damien saw him every day too. The boy barely spoke, just sat beside his mother's bed holding her hand, sometimes reading to her from books he brought from school, sometimes just sitting in silence with tears running down his face. On the third day after the accident, a hospital social worker named Miss Patricia Lee approached Damien in the waiting room. She was a petite Asian woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she'd seen every kind of family crisis imaginable. "Mr. Langston, I need to speak with you about Tyrone West." Damien's stomach clenched with apprehension. "What about him?" Miss Lee sat down beside him, her clipboard balanced on her knee. "We've been trying to locate any family members who could take temporary custody of Tyrone while his mother is incapacitated. Unfortunately, we've had no success. Shirley West appears to have no living relatives. Her father passed away years ago, and we can't locate any extended family." She listed no emergency contacts other than her son's school. The implications of her words sank in slowly, like stones dropping into deep water. What does that mean for Tyrone? It means that, unless someone, a family friend, or something steps forward as a legal guardian, Tyrone will have to go into the foster care system. Miss Lee's voice was sympathetic but matter-of-fact. "It's not ideal, I know, but it's procedure when a minor has no available family. Foster care." The words sent a chill through Damien that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. He knew what foster care was like. He'd lived it. He and Laura had spent years bouncing between homes, some better than others, always temporary, always uncertain, always waiting for the next placement, the next family who might want them or might not. He remembered the feeling of being unwanted, of being a burden, of watching other kids get adopted while he and Laura were passed over again and again. He remembered the older kids in some homes who'd been cruel, the foster parents who'd been in it for the money rather than any genuine care for the children. He remembered the constant anxiety, the lack of stability, the bone-deep loneliness of being a child with no real home. And he thought about Tyrone, grieving Tyrone who'd just watched his mother get hit by a car, who had no one in the world except that woman lying unconscious in a hospital bed. No. The word came out before Damien had fully thought it through, but once it was out there, he knew it was right. No, he's not going into foster care. Miss Lee raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Langston, I understand you feel responsible, but—" "I am responsible," Damien interrupted. "I'm the one who hit his mother. I'm the reason she's in that bed. I can't—" His voice cracked, and he had to pause to collect himself. I can't let him go into the system. I just can't." "Are you suggesting you'd like to serve as his legal guardian?" Was he? The idea was absurd. He was a 35-year-old playboy who could barely take care of himself, who had no experience with children, who'd been terrified of commitment his entire adult life. What business did he have becoming anyone's guardian? But then he thought about Tyrone's face when he'd seen his mother get hit. The raw, devastating grief. The bone-deep terror of a child who'd just lost everything. "Yes," Damien said firmly. "I want to be his legal guardian." Miss Lee studied him for a long moment, and Damien had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see right through him, could see all his doubts and inadequacies and fears. "This isn't a decision to make lightly, Mr. Langston. Guardianship is a serious legal responsibility. You'd be taking on the care of a traumatized 12-year-old boy who's just experienced a significant loss." "I know. Are you sure?" Miss Lee's voice was gentle but challenging. "Because, from what I understand, you're a very busy CEO with a demanding career. You're unmarried, with no children of your own. You have no experience being a parent. Are you truly prepared for this?" Damien thought about his penthouse, his sports cars, his revolving door of women, his late nights at bars and clubs. He thought about the life he'd built so carefully, the freedom he'd guarded so jealously. And then he thought about Richard and Iris Langston, who'd been in their 50s when they'd chosen to adopt two traumatized teenagers, who'd rearranged their comfortable, settled lives to make room for two kids they didn't know, who'd loved them unconditionally, patiently, persistently, until Damien and Laura had finally believed they deserved that love. "I'm prepared to try," he said quietly. "I'm prepared to do whatever it takes." Miss Lee nodded slowly. "There will be home visits, background checks, interviews. The court will want to ensure you're a suitable guardian. This process could take several days. Then let's start now." Over the next 72 hours, Damien's life became a whirlwind of legal paperwork, background checks, and interviews with social workers. The Langston name and wealth certainly helped expedite the process, but Damien could tell that Miss Lee and her colleagues were genuinely trying to determine if he was suitable to care for a grieving child. They asked him about his lifestyle, his work schedule, his living situation, his support system. They asked about his own experience in foster care, about his relationship with his adoptive parents, about his understanding of what Tyrone would need. Damien answered honestly, not trying to hide his playboy past or his inexperience with children. He explained that he knew he wasn't perfect, wasn't the ideal candidate, but that he wouldn't let Tyrone go into the system. On the 4th day, he got the call from Miss Lee. "The court has approved your petition for temporary guardianship. You'll need to attend regular check-ins, and we'll be monitoring the situation closely, but Tyrone can go home with you today." Relief and terror washed over Damien in equal measure. He'd done it. He was now legally responsible for a 12-year-old boy. What had he just gotten himself into? When he went to tell Tyrone, he found the boy in his usual spot beside his mother's bed, reading aloud from what looked like a school textbook. History, Damien thought. Something about World War II. "Tyrone," Damien said softly, not wanting to startle him. "Can we talk?" The boy looked up, his expression wary and guarded. In the days since the accident, Tyrone had barely spoken to Damien beyond the most basic necessities. The hatred in his eyes had faded to something more like resignation, but there was no warmth there, no trust. "What?" Tyrone's voice was flat, emotionless. "The social worker came to talk to me about what happens with you while your mom is recovering." Tyrone's hands tightened on his book. "They want to put me in foster care." It wasn't a question. "They did," Damien confirmed. "But I've become your legal guardian, temporarily. You're going to come stay with me." The boy's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly to read. Surprise, confusion, suspicion. Why would you do that? It was a fair question, and one Damien had asked himself repeatedly over the past few days. Because I know what foster care is like. I grew up in it. And I couldn't let you go through that. Not when I'm the reason you're in this situation in the first place. You feel guilty, Tyrone said, and there was an edge to his voice that sounded far too adult for a 12-year-old. You think taking care of me will make up for what you did. The words stung, probably because they were at least partially true. I do feel guilty, Damien admitted. I probably always will, but that's not the only reason. I genuinely don't want you to go into the system, Tyrone. I want to help, if you'll let me. Tyrone looked at him for a long moment, then back at his mother's peaceful, sleeping face. Do I have a choice? You always have a choice, Damien said, even though he knew that wasn't entirely true. But I'm hoping you'll give me a chance. I know I'm not your father, and I know you have every reason to hate me. But I promise I'll do everything I can to take care of you until your mom wakes up. When, not if. Damien made sure to use the word when, because if was too terrifying to contemplate. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Tyrone nodded. Okay, it wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even acceptance, really, but it was a start. The first attempt at managing this new arrangement came that evening when Damien tried to call his parents. Richard and Iris were currently traveling through Europe, a 3-month trip they'd been planning for years, and Damien hated to interrupt their vacation with this news. Damien, darling, his mother's voice came through warm and cheerful, the faint sounds of Italian in the background, suggesting they were at a restaurant. What a lovely surprise. How are you? Hi, Mom. Is Dad there? I need to talk to both of you about something important. The cheerfulness in Iris's voice shifted to concern. Is everything all right? You're not hurt, are you? I'm fine. But something has happened, and I need your help. He explained everything. The accident, Shirley's coma, Tyrone, the guardianship. His parents listened in silence, and Damien could picture his mother's face shifting through concern and surprise, and that particular brand of maternal worry that she'd perfected over the years. When he finished, there was a long pause before Richard spoke. Son, that's a huge responsibility. Are you sure you're ready for this? No, Damien admitted, but I couldn't let him go into foster care. I just couldn't. We understand that, Iris said gently, and we're proud of you for stepping up. I was hoping maybe, Damien started, you guys could maybe come back a bit early, and Tyrone could stay with you while I figure things out. Just for a little while. Another pause, and this time Damien could hear his parents having a whispered conversation in the background. Finally, Richard came back on the line. Damien, we love you, and we'll support you however we can. But we're not coming home early, and we're not taking Tyrone off your hands. The words felt like a rejection, and Damien's chest tightened. Dad, I can't do this alone. I don't know the first thing about being a parent. Then you'll learn, Iris interrupted, her voice firm but loving. Damien, when your father and I adopted you and Laura, we had no idea what we were doing. We'd never been parents before. We made 1,000 mistakes, but we learned, and we grew, and we figured it out because we had to, because you two needed us. But I'm not like you, Damien protested. I'm not patient and kind and selfless. I'm selfish. I'm irresponsible. I don't know how to put anyone else's needs before my own. Then this will be good for you, Richard said, and there was a note of steel in his voice that Damien recognized from his childhood, the tone that meant this discussion was over. You've been coasting through life, son, avoiding anything that requires real commitment or sacrifice. Maybe this is exactly what you need to finally grow up." The words hit harder than they should have, cutting through Damien's defenses. "I'm 35 years old. I run a multi-million-dollar company. I think I'm pretty grown up." "Being an adult and growing up are two different things," Iris said gently. "You can be successful and wealthy and still be emotionally immature, darling. And you have been, in many ways. Not because you're a bad person, but because you've been protecting yourself, keeping people at arm's length, so you never have to risk getting hurt. This child needs you," Richard added. "And whether you realize it or not, you might need him too. So handle it, Damien. Step up. Be the man we raised you to be." After they hung up, Damien sat in his car in the hospital parking lot, his parents' words echoing in his head. They were right, he knew. He'd been using his childhood trauma as an excuse to avoid emotional growth for years, and now he was being forced to face it head-on. His next call was to his sister, Laura, thinking maybe she'd be more sympathetic. She wasn't. "Let me get this straight," Laura said, after he'd explained the situation. "You became the legal guardian of a 12-year-old boy you barely know, and now you want to dump him with me?" "I'm not trying to dump him. That's exactly what you're trying to do," Laura interrupted. "Damien, I love you, but this is ridiculous. You made a commitment to that child. You told the court you'd take care of him. You can't just pass him off to someone else because parenting is hard." "I didn't say it was hard," Damien protested weakly. "You were going to," Laura shot back. "Look, I know you're scared. I know this is way outside your comfort zone. But running away from responsibility is literally what got you into this mess in the first place. You were distracted, rushing to a meeting because you'd overslept with some random woman, and you hit this poor woman with your car." The words were harsh but true, and Damien flinched. "Now you have a chance to actually do something good," Laura continued, her voice softening slightly. "To take responsibility not just legally but emotionally. To show up for this kid who has absolutely no one else. Are you really going to waste that chance?" "I don't know how to be a parent," Damien said quietly. "None of us do. Not until we actually become one," Laura replied. "You think I knew what I was doing when Olivia was born? I was terrified. But you figure it out, day by day, mistake by mistake. And you have resources, Damien. You can afford the best therapists, the best schools, all the support you need. What that boy needs from you isn't perfection. He needs consistency, presence, someone who gives a damn." After he hung up with Laura, Damien sat in silence for a long time, the weight of responsibility settling over him like a heavy blanket. His family wasn't going to rescue him from this. They weren't going to let him off the hook, or make this easier. He was on his own. Well, not entirely on his own. He had Tyrone now. That thought should have been terrifying. It was terrifying. But somewhere beneath the fear, there was something else. Something that felt almost like purpose. Hello guys. Thanks for following this story up to this part. But I'm sorry, but I'll have to stop here for today. I don't want to make the it too long. But if you want me to continue and finish this beautiful story, just type in the comments section, part 2 needed, and I'll drop the remaining part. Also guys, before you go, I noticed our stories of late have really been struggling to reach our audiences. And this is partially because you guys are not engaging with our stories like before. Please, my beautiful family, it only takes a few seconds to like, subscribe, or even comment on this story. So, please, if you are enjoying our stories, don't forget to like, subscribe if you haven't already, and share with a fellow romantic story lover like yourself. And also, let me know in the comment section what you think will happen in the part 2 of this story. Thank you.